Searching for his lost son, a wealthy man stumbled upon a cabin deep in the woods. Overhearing a conversation about an inheritance, he froze. This was a surprise he hadn't expected. Fred Blake had been wandering through the dense forest undergrowth for hours, but had yet to find his son. He seemed to have combed through every bush. 7-year-old Dustin was nowhere in sight. Suddenly, about 50 meters off the forest path, he noticed a barely visible cabin made of thin logs. The businessman's heart raced with anticipation. What if Dustin was there? Of course, where else would he be? Approaching the cabin carefully, he soon heard voices from inside. Fred tensed up. The voices were male, coarse, and unfamiliar. What do you think, Robert? Are we gonna get our cut from the inheritance soon? She's as good as gone anyway, asked one of them. Well, it all depends on the mistress. This whole thing was her idea, after all, replied the other. Fred flinched. What inheritance were they talking about? He had so many questions that he decided to hold off on any answers, hiding in the bushes to see what would happen next. The cabin door opened with a vile creak of unoiled hinges. On the threshold stood 2 men dressed in camouflage gear. Hunters or poachers, he thought frantically. He was about to step out of the bushes when he noticed a rifle in one of their hands. All right, Tyrone, let's go hunting. I'm starving. She can just lie there. That sleeping pill should work for another 3 or 4 hours, suggested one of the strangers. Hiding in the bushes, Fred paled. This pair looked more than a little suspicious. Who were they keeping in their cabin? Yeah, might as well go hunting. Who knows how long we'll have to wait here, the other finally agreed, then headed into the thicket, passing just a few meters from Fred. As he watched the strangers disappear into the forest, the businessman shifted his gaze back to the cabin and saw that they hadn't even closed the door properly, securing it with only a pine log. Still unsure of what he would find inside, Fred approached the cabin and opened the door. Almost immediately, he saw a bed in the corner. Lying unconscious on it was a young woman, barely in her 20s. Only now did he understand what the hunters had meant about the sleeping pill. Realizing that something strange was going on, Fred stepped inside and tried to wake the young woman. But she was so weak that she could barely open her eyes for a second before sinking back into a sticky oblivion. Come on, wake up. Now's not the time to be sleeping, Fred pleaded. But it was no use. She lay limp on the old mattress, as powerless as a doll, unable to utter a single word. Shaking his head, Fred finally swept her into his arms and hurried toward the door. What else was he supposed to do? Wait for those bearded men with guns to come back? No way, we'll get out of here on our own, even if it's on foot, he thought, cursing himself for getting involved. Carrying the girl along the forest trail, he silently prayed they wouldn't be pursued. And yet, he hadn't forgotten about his son, still lost somewhere in the forest. With each passing minute, carrying her became harder. His breathing grew labored, his muscles began to tremble, and sweat trickled down his face. This was supposed to be a simple fishing trip, he thought bitterly. They'd barely cast their lines when he'd started getting calls from work, one after another, until he'd even had to fetch his laptop from the car. Dustin must have gotten bored and wandered off. The forest was practically right there. Now, despair tightened its grip on him. What good were his riches in this desolate place? He could barely even get a signal, with just a flickering bar on his phone. Meanwhile, he noticed the stranger was beginning to stir. Oh, thank God, finally, he whispered, relieved. He carefully laid her down on the forest floor, which was covered in last year's leaves and pine needles, hoping to catch his breath. The girl opened her eyes briefly, gasped softly, and then lost consciousness again. Fred bit his lip in frustration. Miriam had told him to stay home. But no, he'd insisted on going anyway. Stubborn idiot. The forest was darkening quickly, wrapped in a heavy twilight. The trees, like towering phantoms, stretched their twisted branches toward the sky, hiding the last rays of the setting sun. Fred felt a chill run through him. It was one thing to wander in the daylight, It was another entirely in the looming night. And weren't there supposed to be wolves around here too? Realizing the girl could get hypothermia, he took off his windbreaker and draped it over her shoulders. After all, October was nearly here, and the nights were already getting quite cold. Suddenly, just a couple of meters away, Fred heard the sharp crack of a dry branch. In the silence of the evening forest, the sound echoed like a gunshot. He frantically scanned his surroundings, trying to find something, anything, for self-defense, maybe a rock or at least a sturdy branch. The sound repeated. Fred's body tensed. It must be wolves. He'd seen it on TV. They'd surround him, tear him to pieces. This is how Fred Blake dies, he thought. In the heart of a forest, to the ominous growls of gray hunters, he strained his hearing, but could see nothing in the darkness. Only the branches swayed in the wind. Who's there? Show yourself, he called out, his voice trembling with tension. The crack sounded again, even closer this time. Fred instinctively pulled the stranger closer to him, shielding her with his own body. Suddenly, a large dark shape emerged from the shadows. Fred staggered back, bracing for an attack, but the creature retreated into the bushes. Asterisk, that's it. The wolves are here, asterisk, he thought. Don't be afraid, came a calm voice from the darkness, he won't harm you. And then, out of the shadows stepped a huge dog, its coat black as pitch. Behind it, a figure slowly emerged, a tall, thin old man with a long, gray beard and kind eyes. Hello, the stranger began, his voice soft yet confident. Don't be afraid, this is Cooper. He doesn't bite. Fred gently lowered the young woman to the ground and finally exhaled. The fear that had gripped him began to fade. Who are you? He asked, still on edge. Gary Garner, the old man replied with a warm smile, and you must be Fred. I've been looking for you for a while. Fred recoiled in shock. How did this man know his name? But how? Fred stammered, barely containing his anxiety. I found Dustin, the old man said, a touch of sadness in his eyes, your son. A jolt went through Fred like an electric shock. Dustin, God, Dustin's alive. You found him? Fred managed, barely holding back tears. Yes, Gary confirmed, he twisted his ankle but is recovering. Where is he? Fred asked urgently. With me, Gary answered, I live nearby. Fred felt his legs grow weak from the surge of relief and joy. Finally, his son was safe, his heart overflowed with gratitude toward this old man. Thank you so much, Fred whispered. Oh, it's nothing, Gary replied warmly. I'm glad I could help. After a moment, he added, and this young woman, who is she? I don't know, Fred admitted. She was in a cabin. Either hunters or poachers were keeping her there like a prisoner. They were talking about some inheritance. Gary frowned. An inheritance? That's interesting. Maybe we should go to your cabin? Fred suggested, eager to see Dustin. Of course. Let's go, Gary agreed, scratching Cooper's neck as the big dog trotted ahead, wagging his tail. Gary's cabin was small, built from logs with a low, turf-covered roof. Inside, a fire crackled in a simple stone hearth, and a pot hung over the flames, filling the air with a warm, calming scent of herbs. Come in, Gary said, gesturing to a rough-hewn wooden bench. Rest a while. I'll make some tea with marjoram and St. John's wort. It'll calm you and warm your soul. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit by an oil lamp, and the air was rich with the scent of herbs and pine resin. Fred gently set the young woman on the bench, covering her with a wool blanket he found nearby. Then, feeling his excitement rise, he noticed a small door leading to another room. Gary gave him an understanding nod. He's in there, resting. Poor boy's worn out. Fred stepped quietly to the door and cracked it open. There, on an old quilted bed, lay his son, sleeping soundly. Thank God, he's safe, Fred thought, feeling an immense wave of relief wash over him. Meanwhile, Gary had finished preparing the tea and invited him over to the table. Come on, sit down. No need to worry now. It all turned out all right, Gary reassured him. Fred felt a warmth spread through his body, soothing his nerves. Taking a large sip of the herbal tea, he tasted the subtle sweetness of the herbs. A sense of calm settled over him. I gather everything nature provides, Gary said, noticing Fred's gaze on the bundles of dried herbs hanging throughout the cabin. It's my way of life. How did you end up here? Fred asked. Oh, it's a rather sad story, Gary sighed. Once, I was a paramedic, working emergency response, fighting to save lives. So, you're a doctor? Fred asked, surprised. Paramedic, to be precise, Gary corrected, but then everything changed. He sank onto a sturdy wooden chair, his rough, calloused hands resting on his lap, though his eyes still sparkled with a faint light. My wife, Ethel, was in a terrible accident. A bus collided with a truck in thick fog. The driver did well, he turned the wheel just in time. It could have been much worse, but still, the collision couldn't be avoided. I was one of the first on the scene, did everything I could, but Gary's voice faltered, and he fell silent, lost in painful memories. Fred waited, sensing it was better to give him a moment. I couldn't save her, Gary finally continued, his eyes glistening. After that, I lost faith in myself and everything. I withdrew from the world and found solace here, in the forest, learning the language of herbs. Nature is like an open book for me now. You're right, Fred said softly, feeling his respect for this reclusive healer deepen. Indeed, Gary nodded. Each plant has its unique power, and it can heal. I've studied many plants in these parts, there's a whole science to it. Now, let's prepare a decoction to help this poor girl wake up and recover. She's likely under the effects of a sedative, and we need to clear it from her system. Gary got up and gathered a few dried leaves, roots, and flowers. Their fragrance filled the cabin with a soothing aroma. He waited for the mixture to steep, then took a cup with steady, practiced hands. Gently, he brought the drink to the young woman's lips, carefully dripping a bit of the warm liquid onto her pale, lifeless lips. It's essential that she drinks it slowly, Gary explained. Too fast, and it might make her feel nauseous. At first, Fred held his breath, simply watching, then found the courage to help however he could, supporting her shoulders and ensuring her head stayed upright. Gradually, each drop seemed to bring her fragile body back to life. Suddenly, he noticed her eyelashes flutter, and then, "She's awake!" Fred exclaimed in relief. The girl opened her eyes and looked at her rescuers in confusion. Her pupils, wide with surprise, seemed enormous, full of anxiety and incomprehension. "Where am I? Who are you?" she whispered. Fred, unable to contain his emotions, leaned toward her and gently said, "My name is Fred. And this is Gary. He helped me find my son and brought you back to consciousness." "I don't understand anything," the girl murmured softly, glancing around the hut. "How did I end up here?" "You'll remember later," Fred replied kindly. "The main thing is to rest now." "No, I can't just lie here," she exclaimed, trying to sit up. But a wave of dizziness hit her instantly. "Oh, it hurts." "Just lie down, dear, don't argue," Gary said. "The herbal brew will take effect soon and help your body recover." The girl obediently lay back down. "Thank you," she whispered. "Oh, it's nothing," Gary replied. "Just focus on recovering and regaining your strength. The amnesia might have been caused by some kind of sedative they put in your system. Your memory will likely return, but it'll take time. Just be patient." Fred, watching as she slowly closed her eyes and drifted back into sleep, couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. He still didn't know who she was or how she had ended up in the middle of this dangerous situation. "I see you're worried," Gary said, turning to him. "Don't be. She's safe now." "Yes, I'm worried," Fred admitted. "So she really doesn't remember anything?" "It's a temporary state," Gary assured him. "The brew will help." "And what about those hunters?" Fred asked. "Are you sure they won't come back?" "If they do, "It won't be anytime soon," Gary replied. "But I'm sure they're looking for her. And they know this could be dangerous." "Dangerous?" Fred asked. "Yes, very dangerous. Those poachers are working illegally around here. The ranger retired long ago, not in the best of health anymore." Fred nodded, realizing that he might have to solve the mysteries surrounding this girl. He couldn't just leave her on her own, especially after seeing that she'd been held captive. He was determined to uncover the truth, especially now that Dustin had been found, and by morning they could start their journey home. Miriam was surely beside herself with worry by now. Though she was Dustin's stepmother, she truly loved him with all her heart. Dustin didn't quite understand this yet, but Fred was sure he'd come to realize it with time. As Fred gazed into the glowing hearth in the cabin, his thoughts drifted back to his distant past, to his childhood, spent in a small village where he was born and spent his earliest years. Memories surfaced of summer days full of sunshine, warmth, and carefree games with his friends. He could picture the wooden house with its fresh scent, mingled with the aroma of his mother's baking. "Fred," he recalled his mother's voice, "come in for lunch." "Mom, later. Can I play football with the boys for a bit?" "All right, go play a little longer," Kristen would smile, "but don't forget to come in after." He remembered the meadows, dotted with daisies, and the endless blue sky. He could almost smell the freshly cut grass and taste the wild strawberries he used to gather with his grandfather in the woods. "Grandpa," he'd ask, "why is the sky blue?" "Well, my boy," Edwin would answer, "because it reflects the sea. I served in the Navy, so I know that for sure." Fred often rode his beloved bicycle, a birthday gift from his parents, feeling like the happiest kid in the world as he pedaled along winding paths. "Fred," his grandfather would call after him. "Where are you off to now?" "Going fishing. The boys say there's pike to be caught." "You rascal, and you couldn't invite me?" Grandpa Edwin would chuckle, watching his grandson with pride. But one day, the bike disappeared. Fred cried his heart out. "Now, don't you fret," Grandpa comforted him. "We'll find that rascal yet." They searched the village, asking people along the way, but the bike seemed to have vanished into thin air. Fred was inconsolable for days. "Well then," Edwin finally said, "we'll get you a new one, and this one can bring joy to some other kid." But the feeling of loss, injustice, and resentment lingered in his heart for a long time. Soon after, young Fred's mind drifted to memories of fishing with his grandfather. When a huge pike bit Fred's line, he struggled to reel it to shore. "Look, Grandpa, what a catch," he shouted proudly. But the pike was slippery and powerful. It twisted out of Fred's hands and, with a strong flick of its tail, darted back into the water. Fred let out a disappointed laugh. "So much for fishing." "Don't be discouraged," Grandpa reassured him. "There'll be more pike in your life. Just remember, when you do catch one, make 3 wishes right away, and they're sure to come true." "Really?" Fred's eyes widened in surprise. "Of course," Grandpa replied. "Why else do you think pike are here on this earth? Not just to chase minnows in the reeds, no, sir. They're here to grant wishes, but only to people with pure intentions." Fred's childhood memories felt so vivid, as if it all had happened just yesterday. Every detail remained sharp in his mind. Fred had been a diligent student in school. As class president, he took part in every event and always strived to do his best. Fred Blake's been elected president, his classmates teased, though not for long. Fred's thirst for knowledge was insatiable, and he took on every challenge with ease, always ready to help a friend. "Fred, you're very capable," his math teacher would tell him. "You should definitely aim for university." Inspired by her words, Fred started preparing for exams with determination. He dreamed of moving to a big city and discovering new opportunities. After months of hard work, he passed his entrance exams and was accepted into a prestigious university. Moving to the city felt like a grand adventure. "Mind if I sit here?" he heard someone say as he settled into his seat by the bus window. Fred looked up and saw a girl with eyes as bright as a summer sky. She was stunning, with soft hair and a barely there smile that held a hint of mystery. "Of course, please do," Fred replied warmly. "My name is Loretta," she introduced herself. "I'm Fred," he replied, feeling his heartbeat quicken. As they traveled, the young couple struck up a conversation. They both loved good music and, being from the provinces, dreamed of making a name for themselves in the big city. Fred was captivated from the first moment. Loretta seemed so genuine, kind, and enchanting that he couldn't take his eyes off her. In that moment, he realized that his life had divided into before and after. Loretta became his light, his reason for living. After that memorable bus ride, they started dating. "Fred, I really like you," Loretta confessed one day, her voice soft and gentle like a summer breeze. "I like you too," Fred replied, squeezing her hand. Once he became a student in the economics department, he plunged into a new world filled with noise, bright lights, and new acquaintances. Fred and Loretta's relationship blossomed quickly. They got married in their third year, having a modest yet very touching student wedding. They received an apartment in a shared housing complex, and with the money gifted by relatives, they bought some furniture. "Now we'll always be together," Fred whispered, kissing his wife. They were happy. Loretta, surrounded by Fred's affection and care, felt like a queen who had finally found her happiness. "Fred, I want a child," she confessed one evening. "Of course, I've been thinking about that too," Fred replied, his heart overflowing with love. But the doctors were firm. Loretta's health was not great, and a pregnancy could endanger her life. "Please, Loretta, don't take risks," the doctors pleaded with her. But Loretta was resolute. She desperately wanted to give Fred a child, a fruit of their love, and didn't consider the potential threats to her future. "I know I'm taking a risk," she said during dinner, "but I can't live with the thought that we won't have a child." "Don't worry. If it comes to the worst, we can always adopt a baby from the orphanage," her husband countered. Time passed, and all attempts to conceive ended in failure. One weekend, Fred decided to go fishing. The autumn weather was pleasant, and the predatory fish were biting well in the local river. Loretta didn't mind, so Fred armed himself with fishing rods and set off. He cast his lure on the spinning rod once, then twice, but got no results. He changed spots, but it was the same story. Just a couple of perch, which were quickly gobbled up by the ginger cat purring at his feet. But when Fred switched to another lure, luck finally smiled upon him. A huge pike bent his spinning rod almost double. The line sang. Fred remembered his grandfather's advice perfectly. Soon, the toothy beauty was in his catch bag. A smile spread across Fred's lips as he thought of how thrilled Loretta would be with such a trophy. But then he suddenly recalled his late grandfather's words and decided to make 3 wishes to the pike. Not just for any reason, of course, but with the condition that he would release her back into the river. It all seemed rather comical when the young man knelt down and leaned over the bag, whispering something. The slippery fish stared at Fred, unblinking, as if she understood every word he said. Finally, after finishing, he untied the top and released the pike back into freedom. Let the beauty live. Huge, like a log. Fred returned home after dark, with an empty catch bag and a mysterious smile on his face. His wife helped him undress, then set dinner on the table. There were potatoes fried in vegetable oil and a salad made from fresh vegetables. For dessert, there were pies with homemade pear jam. Still remembering his late grandfather Edwin's advice, Fred didn't mention what had happened at the river, fearing the pike might get offended and not grant his wishes. A month later, Loretta became pregnant. During that time, she felt unwell. Morning sickness and dizziness became her constant companions throughout the pregnancy. Fred supported her as best as he could. He transferred to distance learning, worked on a construction site, and at night unloaded freight cars at the railway station. What could he do? Life wasn't easy, especially when you came from the provinces and dreamed of conquering the big city. He was on cloud 9 with happiness. He surrounded his wife with care and love. But 6 months after giving birth, Loretta passed away from complications caused by hidden internal bleeding. Fred couldn't come to terms with the loss. He cried at her grave, begging for forgiveness for not being able to protect her. "My love, forgive me," Fred pleaded, tears streaming down his cheeks like an endless stream of pain. He remembered her smile, her voice, those tender hands that touched his face, and the pain of loss intensified. He had to endure a lot before he achieved success and firmly stood on his own 2 feet. Other memories surfaced, distant but no less vivid than the previous ones. He recalled his rapid ascent up the career ladder and the victory that came at the cost of inhuman effort. "Fred, are you sure you can handle the competition?" the director asked during the interview, looking at him over the thick lenses of his gold-rimmed glasses. Fred felt like a boy thrust into a world of big money, complex schemes, and relentless pressure. He had just graduated from the economics faculty, and his diploma with honors was his ticket into the business world. "I'm ready to work, learn new things, and prove that I deserve a place in your company, Michael," Fred replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite his excitement. "Good," nodded his future boss, "we'll hire you. But with a probation period. And William Miller too. You two were classmates, right? We'll see who turns out to be more promising. Remember, I'll keep only one of you on staff." At that moment, Fred didn't fully grasp the seriousness of those words. He was just thrilled that his dreams were coming true. He had landed a job at one of the city's most successful investment companies. Investments in real estate, infrastructure development, strategic portfolio management, and profitable deals involving debt instruments. All of it beckoned to Fred like Aladdin's caves filled with immeasurable treasures. William, his main competitor since their university days, was his complete opposite. Self-assured, brash, and looking like a true playboy, he came from a wealthy family and had connections in the upper echelons of management at the country's largest companies. "So, Fred, ready for the fight?" William smiled, giving him a pat on the shoulder. "The company is a battlefield, and only one of us will emerge victorious." William's words carried a challenge and a hidden subtext of competition. But Fred didn't pay much attention to it at the time. He was full of enthusiasm and eager to work. Despite all his apparent advantages, William was not as smart as Fred and had no intention of laying down his life for a position. An invisible but fierce struggle ignited between them. They fought for every project, for every assignment. Each day was intense. Fred took on extra responsibilities, working 16 hours a day. He analyzed the market, assessed technology prospects, and conducted economic modeling of projects. He did all this with one goal in mind: to win and secure his place on the staff. During those years, he devoted all his energy to work and saw no meaning in life beyond his job and raising his son. Of course, such dedication couldn't help but yield results. Soon, Michael Gordon formally announced Fred Blake's permanent position at the company. But the victory came with a bitter aftertaste. William harbored resentment and had not forgiven his defeat. "Well then, enjoy your victory, Fred," William hissed, shaking his hand. "You worked so hard that your world has shrunk to just your job. You lost your wife, and now you'll lose your son too." Fred flinched at those words. He understood. William wasn't just envious, he wished him harm. Life went on. Fred continued to build his career, striving to be the best in his field. He raised his son, trying to give him all that Loretta could not provide. During Fred's absence, his loyal and devoted nanny, Ellen Taylor, looked after Dustin. He considered her part of his family. But William did not forget his quest for revenge. He tried to approach the Guardianship Council to strip Fred of his parental rights. Spreading rumors, the arrogant rich kid slandered Fred and attempted to set him up. "He doesn't deserve to be a father," William declared to the council members. "He often leaves the child unsupervised and doesn't care for him at all." But Fred was ready to fight to the end. He gathered documents, hired the best lawyers, and defended his rights in court. William was defeated once again, this time for the second time. "You're an excellent father, Fred," the judge said with feeling, delivering the verdict in his favor. You care for your son and provide him with the best education and upbringing." Fred exhaled in relief and brushed away a tear. He had succeeded once again, though he understood that the war was far from over. William was not the type to back down easily, especially since, according to rumors, his father had gone bankrupt and landed in prison for tax evasion. And his mother, without a second thought, had gathered her remaining money and left for abroad with her young lover. At that moment, even more vivid memories flashed through Fred's mind. 2 years ago. The parking lot in front of the shopping center. He was hurrying to meet someone, tired after a long day of work, when he suddenly saw her. Miriam. A dazzling beauty in a bright dress with wavy hair, like a ray of sunshine cutting through the gray urban hustle. It was drizzling lightly, making the asphalt very slippery. "Watch out!" Fred shouted, barely noticing how the stranger heading toward the bus stop slipped on the wet tiles. Losing her balance, she fell to her knees with a short cry. Fred rushed over, his heart racing with concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, extending his hand. The girl looked up at her savior with a bewildered expression. "I think I broke my heel," she replied, her voice tinged with mild confusion. "Can I help you?" Fred offered, helping her to her feet. "Thank you," she said with a flirtatious smile. "My name is Miriam." "I'm Fred," he replied, unable to take his eyes off her. And at that moment, it felt as if a lightning bolt had struck in his soul. He sensed his heart racing. It was a long-forgotten feeling. Something warm, tender, and at the same time incredibly powerful. Miriam looked at him, smiling, and her smile, like a sunbeam, finally chased away his loneliness. "Could you give me a ride home?" she asked. "Unfortunately, it seems that my car has a flat tire." "I'd be happy to," he answered, genuinely elated. The drive to her house seemed to fly by in an instant. Fred talked, laughed, and was filled with enthusiasm. Miriam listened and smiled. "I haven't felt this light in a long time," he confessed, stopping the car. Miriam looked at him and smiled tenderly. "You're such a good person, Fred. I feel lucky to have met you today." In that moment, Fred realized she was special. They dated for several months, and to their surprise, tender and passionate feelings ignited between them. Miriam lit up Fred's life like the sun, and he spent all his free time with her. Before long, he proposed, and of course, Miriam said yes. The wedding was quiet and romantic, attended only by their closest friends and family. At last, he had found a woman who could understand him, support him, and share not just his joys, but also his sorrows. However, Dustin did not accept Miriam. He was so deeply attached to his father that the new woman in his dad's life became an obstacle for him. Dustin withdrew into himself and, becoming capricious, did everything he could to avoid Miriam. "Dad, she's not my mom," he often said, and Fred could do nothing about it. Miriam tried to bond with her stepson, but he wouldn't respond to her affection or accept her gifts. She even cried at night because of this. Fred would hold her and whisper words of comfort, promising that everything would be all right and that Dustin would eventually get used to her. But the miracle never happened. Gradually, their relationship grew cold and distant. Fred knew he was to blame. After all, his son was his life, his hope. He couldn't sacrifice him for his own love. But on the other hand, Miriam could have shown some loyalty and waited until Dustin warmed up to her. Moreover, for some time now, Fred had started to suspect that Miriam wasn't entirely honest with him. She often secluded herself in her room and spent long hours chatting on the phone with someone. Meanwhile, Fred was rarely home, as he had recently taken over the company after buying the controlling share from the previous owner, who had retired. Suddenly, Fred heard Gary's voice cutting through the heavy haze. "Wake up, Sonia, it's morning. The girl is awake," Grandpa said with a smile. She remembered something, even if not completely. My miracle herb helped her. Fred jumped up immediately. His heart raced like crazy. At that moment, a boy rushed into the room, and his face shone with joy. "Dad, Dad!" he shouted, throwing himself into Fred's arms. "Dustin!" Fred hugged his son tightly. "You scared me, you little rascal." The boy looked at the girl who had just woken up with curiosity and then quietly asked, "Dad, who is she?" "This is a girl I found in the woods," Fred replied, unsure how to explain the situation to his child. "She got lost and doesn't remember anything." "She's pretty," Dustin said, smiling at the stranger. "Maybe she's an angel?" "Quite possibly," Fred smiled back, trying to dispel the worry that had appeared in the girl's eyes. "I felt really bad," she whispered. "I remember my name is Jennifer, but I need to understand what happened." "And I'm Gary," the elderly herbalist replied, gently supporting her. "This is Fred and his son, Dustin. We also have a dog named Cooper, but he sleeps outside." And just as if to confirm his words, a cheerful bark echoed outside the window. Jennifer shook her head, trying to remember anything at all. There was a vast emptiness in her memory, as if someone had wiped everything away that had come before this moment. "Don't worry, everything will be all right," Fred said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll definitely find out what happened to you." During the first half of the day, Jennifer tried to piece together the events leading up to her appearance in the cabin. Fragments, snippets of words, faces, they were all like pieces of a mosaic that couldn't be assembled into a coherent picture. "I remember being given something to drink," she whispered in a weak, trembling voice. "And then everything went dark." "They probably gave you a sedative," Gary said. "I wonder who?" Jennifer asked, her eyes welling with tears. "And why?" Fred exchanged a meaningful glance with the elderly herbalist and shrugged. "I hope we figure that out." Gradually, as Jennifer regained her strength, fragments of memories began to return to her. They weren't complete, of course, more like segments of a damaged film reel, but at the same time, they were painful, sending sharp pangs of hurt under her left shoulder blade. That's when Jennifer remembered how her husband had started staying late at work more often, how his behavior changed, and how he became cold and distant. "William, he was talking to me about some business deals, inheritance, and then offered me tea from a thermos, and that's all. We were standing by my father's grave." "It had just been a year since his death," Jennifer whispered, her heart tightening. "My husband was with me." "So you remembered his name?" Fred asked, watching her reaction closely. "And his last name?" "Yes, I remembered," she replied. "His name is William Miller. I think he was the one who drugged me with that stuff." Dustin gasped softly, and Gary shook his head. Fred felt as though he had been doused in icy water from head to toe. William Miller. His eternal rival and the man he despised for his cunning and treachery. Fred couldn't believe that William had pulled something like this here as well. "Why do you think he's guilty?" Fred asked, trying not to reveal his emotions. "I don't know for sure," Jennifer replied, "but I remember him talking about the inheritance and how he needed something from me." "Inheritance?" Fred asked, surprised. "Do you have anything to bequeath?" "Well, how should I put it?" The girl said, visibly embarrassed. "I'm the daughter of a famous oil magnate. My dad passed away, and William suggested putting up a new gravestone for the anniversary. That's why I came to check out the cemetery." "So you think William married you for the money?" Fred asked, trying to understand the true motives of his former competitor. "It seems so," Jennifer replied, grimacing, bitterness in her voice. "He never loved me. He only pretended to be a loving husband, flattering my father, begging him to let him on the shareholders' board." "Is there anything else you remember?" Fred asked, trying to piece all the mosaic fragments together. Jennifer frowned. "Yes, I recently found some kind of receipt." "A receipt?" Fred asked. "What was on it?" Jennifer's expression darkened, and she looked at him anxiously. It was a receipt for the purchase of an expensive necklace from a jewelry store. Gary furrowed his brow. "I'm sorry for being blunt, but maybe he was going to gift you that necklace. It's not uncommon in life." No, Jennifer whispered, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I saw him give that necklace to someone else. A friend saw them in a cafe and recorded it on her camera. I couldn't believe it for a long time. I felt something was wrong, Jennifer said, sobbing, but I kept putting off the divorce, and here I am. I understand, Fred said, gently hugging her. That really is awful. William is a true monster, Jennifer whispered, pain in her voice. He stole everything from me, love, trust, my whole life. Fred swallowed hard, still vividly remembering how his last encounter with William ended, bringing no good to either of them. I think you need to go to the police and tell them everything. Unfortunately, that poison has likely left your system by now. Blood tests probably won't show much. But that's not the main thing. If you have your health, everything else will fall into place, Gary concluded. Jennifer nodded in agreement, fully aware that life continues despite her husband's betrayal. I think I can help you if Gary takes me to the river. I left my SUV there, Fred remarked. The elderly herbalist smiled. Of course, I'll take you. What's the issue? The main thing is that the locals haven't taken your car apart for parts during the night. That happens sometimes here. After a leisurely breakfast, the four of them set off on their journey. Well, 5 if you counted Cooper. The loyal dog ran ahead, expertly sniffing out the unnoticeable paths. Throughout the journey, Fred kept glancing back, fearing he might encounter the pair of poachers who had held Jennifer captive in the cabin after she was sedated. He couldn't help but ponder why they had talked about some kind of mistress during their conversation. If William was the one behind the plan and partially executed it, then he should have been referred to as the owner. There was no answer to this question. Who knows what that half-crazed rich kid has in mind? Just think about his stunt to try and strip Fred of his parental rights. It was utterly incomprehensible. Meanwhile, Gary smiled as he led them to the edge of the forest, where a beautiful view of the river unfolded before them. There, by the shore, stood Fred's car, like a symbol of returning to normal life and the familiar world. Here we are, the old man said. This is where your journey ends. Wishing you health and happiness for you and your loved ones. Thank you, Gary, Fred said, his voice full of gratitude. You saved us, me and Dustin, and Jennifer too. We will never forget your kindness. His son, who had not left his side since waking up, waved cheerfully. Goodbye, Grandpa Gary. They approached the car. Fred opened the back door and helped Jennifer climb inside. What about Cooper? Dustin asked, hesitantly following their lead. Gary smiled. Cooper is my companion and friend. He will always be around. But his path is here, in the woods. You have your own road ahead. Fred nodded, realizing that the hermit would likely never leave this corner of the wilderness. He wanted to say something more, but at that moment, a loud bark rang out. Cooper grew anxious, his fur standing on end. What's happening? Fred thought, turning around. Gary furrowed his brow and looked at the river. Look there, he said, pointing at the water. Following his gaze, Fred saw children splashing about on a homemade raft not far from the shore. They had been joyfully shouting and splashing the water with their paddles made from sticks. Suddenly, Fred noticed one of the girls fall overboard. She thrashed about, and her terrified scream shattered the silence. Karen, hold on. Someone shouted from the raft. Fred's heart tightened. He couldn't just stand by and watch a child drown. In that instant, he plunged into the water without a second thought. Fred! Jennifer shouted after him, but he could no longer hear her. All he could think about was the girl. Jumping into the river, he felt the cold water envelop him completely. With all his strength, he swam toward the girl, who was already beginning to sink. Finally, Fred reached her, grabbed her hand, and pulled her toward the shore. Hold on, sweetie, just hold on. The businessman yelled, feeling his lungs burn from lack of oxygen. After a few minutes, they reached the shore, and pulling the girl onto the sand, Fred began to pump the water out of her lungs. Karen, a 10-year-old girl with wet hair and a pale face, coughed, and then water gushed from her mouth. She opened her eyes and stared at her rescuer, seemingly confused about where she was. "Are you okay?" Fred asked with concern in his voice. "Yes, mister, I'm fine." "Please don't be mad at me," the girl whispered, still coughing. He hugged her tightly, trying to warm her with his body heat. He felt her little body shivering. "Thank you," the girl whispered gratefully, looking at her savior. "My name is Karen. I'm from the orphanage, and my friends here are from the village." "No need to thank me," Fred said, continuing to hold her. "If you want, you can come with us. I promise we'll find you a nice place to live." Karen nodded, her eyes welling with tears. She didn't know what awaited her, but for some reason, she believed this kind tall man. Soon, Jennifer, Dustin, and Gary rushed over. Fred quickly explained what had happened, and then he carried Karen to the car to keep her warm. It was autumn, after all. When Jennifer got back into the vehicle, Karen settled beside her. Dustin happily took his place next to the driver in his special car seat. Fred glanced back at Gary, who stood at the edge of the forest watching them. The old man waved, and Fred waved back. They left the woods behind, leaving the mysterious cabin and the kind hermit. Fred didn't know what challenges lay ahead for Jennifer and himself, but deep down, he hoped that everything would be okay now. After about 40 minutes of leisurely driving, they arrived in town. Fred parked outside a small, cozy cafe. But first, he stopped by a children's clothing store and bought Karen some new clothes so she could change into something dry. "Let's grab a bite to eat, and then we'll decide where to go next," he suggested outside while Karen changed in the spacious SUV. No one refused the offer. At the cafe, over cups of tea, Fred shared with Jennifer how he met William, the competition between them, and how he achieved success. The young businessman didn't hide his feelings and pain about his lost wife. He opened up to her as he never had before, revealing almost everything about his past. Jennifer listened, gripping her cup of fragrant tea. She felt sorry for Fred and believed he didn't deserve everything that had happened to him. "Yes, I can imagine it wasn't easy," she said, "but you managed. You really are a strong person." Fred smiled. "Well, I try. There are people depending on me. For Dustin and Loretta. She can see everything from wherever she is. I'm sure of that." Jennifer shook her head, genuinely regretting that she had never had such a devoted and loving husband. In the cafe, Karen warmed up and shared how difficult life was for her in the orphanage. It wasn't because of the caregivers or the food, not at all. Her life was poisoned by the older kids who always treated newcomers poorly, especially when they found out that Karen walked in her sleep. In simple terms, she was influenced by the moon. She was a sleepwalker. Fred looked at the girl with compassion and realized that he could no longer let her go. After all, there's a saying that he who saves a person is now responsible for their fate. At that moment, Dustin, enthusiastically devouring his sandwich, suddenly asked, "Dad, are we going home soon? I'm actually pretty sleepy. I woke up so early today." "Of course, buddy," Fred replied gently, ruffling his son's hair, "we'll be home soon. We just need to drop off Aunt Jennifer first, and then we'll head straight back." Karen, sitting next to Dustin, quietly said, "I want to go home too." Fred looked at her with a fatherly gaze. "Don't worry, Karen, we'll definitely figure something out. But you won't send me back to the orphanage, will you?" she asked, fearfully. "Of course not, forget about that," Fred reassured her and cautiously asked, "So, Jennifer, shall we go? Let's take you home." The girl nodded, and they stepped out of the cafe. The road seemed to stretch endlessly. Fred studied Jennifer's face, trying to decipher her thoughts. But she sat in silence, her eyes filled with sadness. Occasionally, she would flinch as if haunted by nightmares. Karen, sitting in the back seat next to her, had calmed down a bit. She told Dustin stories from her short but troubled life. "And the caregiver said I was a bad girl," Karen said softly. "She yelled at me. Don't listen to her. You're not bad, you're good, just a little sad, Dustin replied. Finally, the car stopped at the gates of the mansion. Fred got out to help Jennifer step out. But when the door of the young heiress's home swung open, he saw something that froze the blood in his veins. In the brightly lit living room, his wife, Miriam, was nestled in the arms of the man he hated most in the world, William. Miriam, dressed in an expensive gown, was pressing herself against him, resting her hand on his shoulder. Fred's head buzzed. He couldn't believe his eyes. Fred? Miriam detached herself from William and approached him with feigned tenderness. Darling, you're here. I'm so glad. What does this mean? What are you doing here? This isn't your home, he asked, trembling with rage. It means, Fred, that you now have nothing to do with Jennifer or her inheritance. And Miriam no longer belongs to you, William replied sharply. You know what? Fred hissed, clenching his fists. You're not human. You belong in prison with those who cannot be rehabilitated. Fred, there's no need for this scene, Miriam whispered, you're scaring me. And I should scare you. Fred shouted. Because you decided to kill an innocent girl. That's all untrue, Miriam stammered. I didn't do anything like that. It was all William's idea. Be quiet, her lover interrupted her. I've already made my decision. Let him know that we planned this together. You see, Fred, you didn't even suspect that Miriam was mine long before she married you. What a fool you were to fall for it. Dustin and Karen, frightened by the scene they witnessed, ran back to the car. Jennifer, Fred said, call the police immediately. William bitterly smirked and, cradling his head in his hands, howled in despair. Within a few minutes, the police arrived. They arrested Miriam and William, leading them out of the house in handcuffs. Silence enveloped the home. Fred looked at Jennifer. Her face seemed pale, yet her eyes shone with joy and hope. You know what? I'm not letting you go anywhere anymore, Fred said. We're going to live together. Thank you, Jennifer whispered, tears sparkling in her eyes. It seems you've saved me for the second time, my guardian angel. A month and a half later, the ill-fated lovers, along with 2 accomplices, were sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Fred, to Dustin's great joy, gained custody of Karen. Finally, the girl found a home where she was loved. Jennifer and Fred, as they had planned, remained together. They realized that their bond was deeper than mere gratitude. They had fallen in love. 6 months later, they tied the knot. Fred couldn't help but notice how remarkably Jennifer had changed. Her eyes sparkled, and she smiled much more often. He understood that true love could blossom under the most unpredictable circumstances, reinforcing his belief in miracles. After all, back then, as he bent over the pike caught in the river, he had asked for 3 things: a son, prosperity, and a strong family. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.